Imagine this. You're standing in the boxing ring. Thousands of fans cheering your name. You're one fight away from becoming the world champion. Your fists are like lightning. Your spirit is a hurricane, unstoppable and fierce. But in a single moment, everything collapses. You're accused of a crime you didn't commit. You're stripped of your freedom, your dreams, your life, all because of the color of your skin. This isn't a fictional story. This is the real life of Rubin Carter, a man who could have been a legend in sports, but instead became a symbol of the fight against racial injustice in the United States. Rubin Carter was born on May 6, 1937, in Paterson, New Jersey, at a time when the United States was deeply divided by race. Segregation laws, known as Jim Crow laws, separated black and white people in schools, restaurants, and even on the streets. Black families, like the Carters, lived in poor neighborhoods with limited access to education, health care, and good jobs. Rubin was the fourth of 7 children, raised by his parents, Lloyd and Bertha Carter, who struggled to make ends meet. His father worked long hours at a factory, while his mother took care of the family. But money was always tight. The Carters lived in a small, rundown house in a segregated neighborhood where black families were forced to live apart from white families. Segregation in the 1940s was everywhere. Black children went to separate schools that were poorly funded compared to white schools. Public places like restaurants, movie theaters, and even bus stops were divided by race. Rubin saw firsthand how his parents and neighbors were treated because of their skin color. He remembered one day when his father came home with bruises on his face. A white man had beaten him for looking at him too long. This wasn't unusual, it was just another day in Paterson for a black family. These experiences shaped Rubin's character. He grew up strong, stubborn, and never afraid to fight. But he had one weakness that made him vulnerable: a severe stutter. From a young age, Rubin struggled to speak, tripping over his words, unable to get a sentence out without pausing. This made him a target for bullies. Other kids in the neighborhood mocked him, calling him names and laughing at his speech. Rubin later wrote in his autobiography that he couldn't talk, but his fists could. Street fights became his way of proving he wasn't weak. Rubin's neighborhood was rough. Gangs roamed the streets, and violence was a part of daily life. Rubin learned early on that he had to protect himself. He carried a small knife, not because he wanted trouble, but because he knew he might need it to survive. By the time he was 10 years old, Rubin was already known as a tough kid who wouldn't back down from a fight. But his temper and his environment soon led him into trouble with the law. When Rubin was 12 years old, he faced the harsh reality of the American justice system. One day, he and his friends were playing on the street when an older man, a known predator, tried to attack one of the boys. Rubin didn't hesitate. He pulled out the knife he carried for protection and stabbed the man to defend his friend. The man survived, but the police were called to the scene. To the white police officer, the details didn't matter. A black kid with a knife attacking a white man was all he needed to see. Rubin was arrested on the spot. His parents tried to explain that he was protecting his friend, but their words fell on deaf ears. The court didn't care about the circumstances either. A white judge sentenced 12-year-old Rubin to a juvenile detention center called Jamesburg. The Jamesburg Home for Boys was more like a prison than a place for rehabilitation. It housed boys aged 8 to 18, and the conditions were horrific. The guards were cruel, often beating the boys for minor infractions. Older inmates bullied the younger ones, and there was little supervision to stop it. Rubin, being one of the youngest, became a target. His stutter made things worse. Other boys mocked him, and the guards punished him for fighting back. But even in this harsh environment, Rubin refused to break. He learned to survive by relying on his strength and determination. He spent his days in Jamesburg fighting with other boys, not out of anger, but to protect himself. These fights became his first real training ground. He learned how to throw punches, how to take a hit, and how to keep going even. He was exhausted. Rubin later said that he realized in that place that you either fight or you get crushed. Jamesburg also taught Rubin about the system. He saw how the guards treated black boys worse than white boys, how the rules were applied unfairly, how the system was designed to keep people like him down. These lessons stayed with him for the rest of his life, fueling his anger, but also giving him a sense of purpose. He knew he had to get out and make something of himself. In 1954, Rubin was 17 years old. He decided he couldn't take it anymore. He escaped from Jamesburg, climbing over the fence in the middle of the night and disappearing into the woods. He knew that if he was caught, he'd face even harsher punishment, but freedom was worth the risk. After days of hiding, he made his way to Philadelphia, determined to start a new life. To avoid being sent back to Jamesburg, Rubin enlisted in the U.S. Army. It was a risky move. The military in the 1950s was still segregated, and black soldiers often faced discrimination. But for Rubin, it was a chance to escape his past. He was sent to West Germany, where he served in the paratrooper division. In the Army, Rubin discovered boxing. His natural strength and aggressive style made him a standout in the military's amateur boxing tournaments. He fought with a ferocity that left his opponents stunned, winning several championships among the soldiers and earning medals and recognition. For the first time in his life, Rubin felt like he had found his calling. He later wrote that the ring was the one place where he could be himself. The Army also helped Rubin with his stutter. He worked with a speech therapist who taught him breathing exercises to control his speech. While the stutter never fully went away, Rubin became more confident in speaking, a skill that would later help him when he had to speak to the press and his lawyers during his fight for freedom. In 1956, Rubin was discharged from the Army and returned to Paterson. He was 19 years old, full of determination to become a professional boxer. But coming back home wasn't easy. The police in Paterson knew about his past in Jamesburg, and they watched his every move. Rubin knew he had to be careful, but he wasn't going to let anything stop him. His dream of becoming a world champion was closer than ever. Rubin Carter made his professional boxing debut on September 21, 1961, against a fighter named Pike Reed. Reed was an experienced boxer, but he wasn't prepared for what Rubin brought to the ring. From the first bell, Rubin attacked with incredible power and speed. His punches were like thunder, and Reed couldn't keep up. In the second round, Rubin landed a devastating right hook that sent Reed to the canvas. The fight was over. Rubin had won by knockout. That first fight set the tone for Rubin's career. His style was unique, combining raw power, lightning-fast speed, and relentless aggression. Opponents feared him from the moment they stepped into the ring. Sports writers started calling him Hurricane after just a few fights. One journalist wrote that he doesn't just fight, he sweeps through the ring like a hurricane. Fans loved him for his intensity. Every fight with Rubin Carter was a spectacle. By 1963, Rubin had become one of the top contenders in the middleweight division. His record was impressive: 17 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw. He knocked out tough fighters like Florio Pierce and Jimmy Ellis, earning a reputation as a knockout artist. Rubin wasn't just a boxer, he was a symbol of hope for black Americans. In a time when black athletes were often expected to stay quiet and know their place, Rubin was unapologetically himself. He walked into the ring with a shaved head, wearing black gloves, his eyes burning with determination. But outside the ring, Rubin's life was far from triumphant. In the 1960s, America was still steeped in racism. Jim Crow laws might have been fading in some places, but segregation and discrimination were still the norm. Police brutality against black Americans was common, and Rubin, as a successful black man, became a target for law enforcement. One night, after a victorious fight in New York, Rubin was driving home to Paterson. A police car pulled him over for no reason. The officers searched his car, threatened to arrest him, and made racist remarks, saying that Rubin thought he was a big shot because he beat white guys in the ring, and that they would put him in his place. Rubin stayed calm, but the incident left him shaken. He knew the police saw him as a threat, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. Another incident happened in 1962, when Rubin was at a bar with friends. A white man started insulting him, using racial slurs. Rubin tried to walk away, but the man kept provoking him. When the police arrived, They arrested Rubin, not the aggressor. He spent the night in jail, even though no charges were filed. These experiences only deepened Rubin's anger toward the system. He later said that they hated him because he was black and successful. Rubin didn't stay silent about the injustice he faced. He started speaking out about racism, which made him even more of a target. In 1963, he met Malcolm X, a leader in the fight for black rights. Malcolm became a source of inspiration for Rubin, showing him that they didn't have to accept injustice. Malcolm's message of self-respect and resistance resonated deeply with Rubin. He also supported the Black Panther Party, a group that advocated for black self-defense against police violence. His radical views and friendships with activists made him a target for the FBI, which was monitoring black leaders at the time. Rubin knew that speaking out could get him in trouble, but he didn't care. He said that if he didn't speak the truth, who would? In 1964, Rubin Carter got the chance he'd been dreaming of, a fight for the world middleweight title against Joey Giardello. This was his moment. The fight took place on December 14, 1964, in Philadelphia, with thousands of fans packed into the arena. Rubin had trained for months, perfecting every punch, every move. He was in the best shape of his life. From the opening bell, Rubin dominated. His punches were lightning fast, and Giardello's defense couldn't hold up. In the third round, Rubin landed a powerful uppercut that nearly knocked Giardello out. The crowd roared. Everyone thought the Hurricane was about to become the new champion. The fight went the full 15 rounds, and Rubin felt confident he had won. But when the judges announced their decision, the arena fell silent. They gave the victory to Joey Giardello. The crowd booed, and sports writers called the decision unfair. Many experts believed Rubin had won at least 9 of the 15 rounds. Some even suspected racial bias played a role. A white champion against a black challenger in 1964 still carried weight. Rubin was devastated. He left the ring without saying a word, retreating to the locker room. His trainer, Jimmy Wild, tried to comfort him, saying that Rubin was better and that they stole the title from him. Rubin knew it wasn't just about the judges. It was another victory for the system that wanted to keep him down. Despite the loss, Rubin didn't give up. He kept fighting, believing his time would come. In 1965, he had several impressive bouts, including a knockout win over Dickinson in the 6th round. Rubin stayed the top 10 of the middleweight rankings, and his name was still mentioned in talks about the title. But outside the ring, the pressure was mounting. The Paterson police watched his every move, and Rubin felt like his life was hanging by a thread. He had no idea that 1966 would be the year that changed everything. On June 17, 1966, a triple murder took place at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson. Around 2:30 in the morning, an unknown gunman walked into the bar and opened fire. 2 men and a woman were killed instantly, and a 4th person, the bartender, was seriously injured but survived. The police arrived minutes later, but they had little to go on. The only clue they had was a vague description. Witnesses saw 2 black men in a white car, driving away from the scene. This description was so general it could have applied to hundreds of people in Paterson. But the police immediately started looking for suspects among black men with a history of trouble with the law. Rubin Carter, a well-known boxer who openly criticized racism, was at the top of their list. That night, Rubin and his friend John Artis were in Paterson, driving a white Dodge Polara, a car Rubin had recently bought. But they had nothing to do with the murders. Rubin had spent the evening at a different bar with friends and was driving Artis home. They were stopped by the police around 3 o'clock in the morning, hours after the murders. When the police pulled over Rubin's car, they had no real reason to arrest him. Rubin and Artis had no weapons, their clothes didn't match the witnesses' descriptions, and they were calm and cooperative. The officers took them to the crime scene, where the surviving bartender, William Marins, was asked to identify them. Marins, in shock and losing consciousness, said they weren't the men he saw. But the police didn't stop there. They took Rubin and Artis to the station and began interrogating them. The interrogation lasted for hours and Rubin quickly realized this was serious. He later said that they weren't looking for the truth, they were looking for someone to blame. The police gave Rubin and Artis a lie detector test, which they both passed, showing they were telling the truth. But the results were ignored. The investigation was full of flaws. The police didn't conduct proper forensic tests. There were no fingerprints, no DNA analysis, which wasn't widely used in the 1960s. Instead, they focused on two witnesses, Alfred Bello and Arthur Bradley, both petty criminals who were near the bar that night. Bello and Bradley initially said they didn't see Rubin or Artis, but the police pressured them, offering to reduce their own criminal charges if they cooperated. A few days later, both changed their stories, claiming they saw Rubin and Artis at the scene with guns in their hands. Their stories were full of contradictions. Bello said Rubin had a pistol, while Bradley claimed it was a shotgun. But the police accepted their testimony as evidence. The trial began in May 1967 at the Patterson County Courthouse. From the start, it was clear the process would be unfair. The jury was all white, even though Patterson had a large black population. The prosecutors used racial stereotypes, portraying Rubin as a dangerous black radical. They brought up his connections to the Black Panthers and his criticism of the police to turn the jury against him. Rubin's lawyers, Raymond Brown and Myron Beldock, tried to point out the lack of evidence. They called witnesses who confirmed Rubin's alibi. He was at another bar with friends at the time of the murders. They also showed that Bello and Bradley's testimony was unreliable. But the jury, influenced by racial bias, didn't care. On May 31, 1967, Rubin Carter and John Artis were found guilty of triple murder. The judge sentenced them to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Rubin was 29 years old. His career, his dreams, his life, everything was gone in an instant. As the verdict was read, Rubin looked at the judge and said that he was innocent and that he would prove it. After the verdict, Rubin was sent to Trenton State Prison, a maximum security facility. He was filled with anger, but not despair. He said that they could take his freedom, but they couldn't take his truth. Rubin knew he wasn't convicted for murder. He was convicted for being a black man who dared to challenge the system. Trenton State Prison was a place where hope went to die. The cells were overcrowded, the food was terrible, and the guards used violence to control the inmates. For Rubin, who was used to freedom and fame, this was a brutal adjustment, but he decided he wouldn't let prison break him. From day one, Rubin refused to follow prison rules. He wouldn't wear the prison uniform, choosing to wear his own clothes instead. He wouldn't eat the prison food, buying snacks from the commissary with money sent by friends. He refused to obey the guards if he thought their orders were unfair. He said that he wasn't a criminal, and he wouldn't act like one. Because of his defiance, Rubin spent most of his time in solitary confinement. The solitary cell was tiny, just 6 feet by 6 feet, with no windows and a dim light that stayed on 24 hours a day. But even in isolation, Rubin didn't lose hope. His time in prison became a test of his strength, but also a time of growth. He spent hours each day reading, filling his mind with knowledge that would later help him. In his fight for freedom, he read books on law, learning about the legal system that had failed him. He studied the Constitution, memorizing amendments that spoke of equal protection under the law rights that had been denied to him. He also read philosophy, finding comfort in the words of thinkers like Socrates and Nietzsche, who wrote about resilience in the face of suffering. Rubin often said that these books kept him sane, giving him a way to escape the concrete walls and steel bars that surrounded him. In solitary confinement, Rubin found ways to keep his mind sharp. He would spend hours doing push-ups and sit-ups in his tiny cell, keeping his body strong even as the years passed. He also started writing more, filling notebooks with his thoughts and ideas. He wrote about the injustice he had faced, but also about hope, about the day he would walk out of prison, the day he would hold his daughter in his arms again. These writings became a lifeline for Rubin, a way to hold on to his dreams in a place designed to crush them. Prison wasn't just about survival for Rubin, it was about resistance. He refused to let the system define him. He wrote letters to his family and friends, telling them he would never give up. He kept a small notebook where he jotted down his thoughts, dreams, and plans for the future. In that notebook, he wrote about the day he would walk out of prison, a free man, and how he would use his freedom to help others. Rubin's defiance inspired other inmates. They saw him as a leader, someone who wouldn't bow to the guards or the system. He often spoke to them about standing up for their rights, even in a place as oppressive as Trenton State Prison. Rubin also became a mentor to other inmates, many of whom were young black men, just like he had been, caught up in a system that didn't care about their innocence. He would talk to them, sharing what he had learned from his years of reading and studying. He told them to never give up, to keep fighting for their freedom, even when it seemed impossible. He taught them how to write appeals, how to speak to their lawyers, how to stand up for themselves. For many of these men, Rubin was a beacon of hope, a reminder that they weren't alone in their struggle. One of the hardest parts of prison for Rubin was being separated from his family. He had a young daughter, Theodora, who was just a baby when he was arrested. He missed her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. He wrote her letters, telling her how much he loved her and how he dreamed of the day they would be together again. But those letters were often censored by the prison guards, who didn't want inmates communicating freely with the outside world. Rubin's wife, May, also struggled during this time. She worked long hours to support their daughter, all while dealing with the pain of having her husband locked away. Rubin felt helpless, knowing he couldn't be there for them, but he promised himself that he would make up for lost time once he was free. Theodora became a source of strength for Rubin during these years. She was growing up without her father, but she never stopped believing in his innocence. She would visit Rubin in prison whenever she could, sitting across from him in the visiting room, separated by a glass partition. She would tell him about her life, her school, her dreams. Rubin cherished these visits, even though they were bittersweet. He hated that he couldn't be there for her, but he was proud of the young woman she was becoming. Theodora often told Rubin that she knew he would come home one day, and her faith in him kept him going. Rubin's time in prison also took a toll on his health. The conditions in Trenton State Prison were harsh, and Rubin often went without proper medical care. He developed stomach problems from the poor quality food, and the stress of his situation weighed heavily on him. But Rubin refused to let his health stop him. He kept pushing forward, determined to see his fight through to the end. He often said that he would rather die fighting for his freedom than live as a broken man in prison. As the years went by, Rubin's case became a symbol of the broader struggle for racial justice in America. The 1970s and 1980s were a time of growing awareness about systemic racism, and Rubin's story resonated with activists who were fighting for change. Organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Poverty Law Center began to take an interest in his case, seeing it as an example of how the justice system failed Black Americans. They wrote articles, held press conferences, and lobbied politicians to take action. Outside the prison walls, Rubin's story was starting to spread. In 1974, Rubin decided to tell his story to the world. He started writing an autobiography called The 16th Round, writing it by hand in between stints in solitary confinement. In the book, Rubin described his childhood, his boxing career, his arrest, and the trial, holding nothing back about his anger toward the system. He said that he was writing this book not to complain, but so the world would know the truth. The 16th Round became a bestseller, bringing Rubin's case to the public's attention. People across America started asking how a man with no evidence against him could be in prison. The book also inspired many celebrities to join the fight for his freedom. In 1975, Rubin's case gained national attention when Bob Dylan, a legendary musician and activist, wrote a song called Hurricane that became an anthem for Rubin's freedom. The song started with the lines, "Pistol shots rang out in the barroom night," and Rubin Carter was the one they blamed. Dylan openly accused the police and the courts of racism, calling Rubin's trial a sham. The song became a hit, and millions of people learned about Rubin's story. Dylan organized a series of concerts to raise money for Rubin's legal defense. When Dylan released the song, it was like a lightning bolt. The song's powerful lyrics told the story of Rubin's arrest and trial, calling out the racism that had put him behind bars. It climbed the charts, reaching millions of listeners who had never heard of Rubin Carter before. Suddenly, people across the country were talking about his case. They wrote letters to politicians, demanding a new trial. They held protests outside courthouses, chanting Rubin's name. Dylan's song didn't just raise awareness, it gave Rubin hope. For the first time in years, he felt like the world was finally listening. Other celebrities joined the cause. Muhammad Ali, a boxing legend and a symbol of black resistance, visited Rubin in prison in 1975, bringing with him a group of reporters to shine a spotlight on his case. The two men sat across from each other, separated by a glass partition, and talked for hours. Ali told Rubin that he believed in his innocence and that he would do everything in his power to help him. After the visit, Ali spoke to the press, saying that Rubin Carter was a victim of a racist system and that he wouldn't rest until he was free. Ali's involvement brought even more attention to Rubin's case, and it inspired other athletes to speak out as well. Actress Ellen Burstyn also joined the cause in 1976 after reading Rubin's book and being moved by his story. She used her platform to speak out about his case, calling for a new investigation. Other stars like Joan Baez and Denzel Washington also lent their voices to the movement. The Rubin Carter Defense Committee, a group of activists in New York, continued to organize rallies and protests, demanding justice for Rubin and John Artis. They reached out to more celebrities, hoping to bring even greater attention to the case. Thousands of people across America held rallies, collected signatures, and demanded a new trial. In New York and Los Angeles, large protests took place, with people holding signs that read "Free the Hurricane." The support from celebrities and activists gave Rubin's legal team a new sense of urgency. His lawyers, Raymond Brown and Myron Beldock, had been working on his case for years, filing appeals and gathering new evidence. In 1976, they finally got a breakthrough. Alfred Bellow and Arthur Bradley, the two witnesses who had testified against Rubin, admitted that they had lied. They said the police had pressured them into giving false testimony, threatening them with longer prison sentences if they didn't cooperate. Bellow even signed an affidavit, swearing that he had never seen Rubin or John Artis at the scene of the crime. This was a major development, and Rubin's lawyers believed it would be enough to overturn the conviction. With this new evidence in hand, Rubin's team pushed for a second trial. They argued that the first trial had been tainted by racism and misconduct, and that the new testimony proved Rubin's innocence. The court agreed to hear the case, and Rubin felt a glimmer of hope. He had been in prison for nearly a decade, and this was the first time he felt like freedom might be within reach. He spent hours preparing with his lawyers, going over every detail of the case, writing notes to himself, reminding himself to stay strong, to keep fighting, no matter what happened. But the second trial, which began in late 1976, was a bitter disappointment. Despite the new evidence, the prosecutors doubled down on their original story. They brought in the same racial stereotypes, painting Rubin as a dangerous black man who couldn't be trusted. They ignored Bellow and Bradley's recantations, claiming the witnesses were unreliable. The judge, who was known for his conservative views, refused to admit key pieces of evidence that could have helped Rubin's case. And the jury, once again, was mostly white. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came down. Rubin Carter and John Artis were found guilty again. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Rubin sat motionless, his face a mask of determination. He had hoped for justice, but he wasn't surprised by the outcome. He knew the system wasn't ready to admit its mistakes. As he was led back to his cell, he turned to his lawyers and said, "I'm not done fighting. This isn't the end." Rubin's words were a promise, not just to himself, but to everyone who believed in him. The second trial left Rubin with a heavy heart, but it didn't break his spirit. He returned to Trenton State Prison, determined to keep fighting. The years that followed were some of the hardest of his life. The prison was a brutal place, and Rubin's defiance often put him at odds with the guards. They saw him as a troublemaker, someone who refused to follow the rules. But Rubin saw himself as a man who was fighting for his dignity. He refused to let the prison strip him of his humanity. By the early 1980s, Rubin had been in prison for over 15 years. He was in his 40s now, and the years behind bars had aged him. But his determination was as strong as ever. He continued to work with his lawyers, going over every detail of his case, looking for any new angle that might lead to his freedom. He also kept writing, using his words to reach out to the world beyond the prison walls. His letters were published in newspapers and magazines, giving people a glimpse into the mind of a man who refused to be broken by injustice. In 1985, Rubin's perseverance finally paid off. His case reached a federal court, where Judge H. Lee Sarakin agreed to review it. Sarakin was known for his fairness and his willingness to take on controversial cases. He spent months going through the evidence, reading the transcripts of the original trials, and examining the new testimony that Rubin's lawyers had uncovered. What he found shocked him. The trials were riddled with errors, from the racial bias of the jury to the misconduct of the police and prosecutors. Sarakin knew he had to act. In November 1985, Sarakin issued a historic ruling. He said that both trials, in 1967 and 1976, were tainted by racial bias. He wrote in his decision that the prosecution was built on racism, not on facts. Sarakin pointed out numerous violations: false testimony, witness coercion, and a biased jury. He overturned the conviction and ordered Rubin's immediate release. On November 27, 1985, Rubin Carter walked out of prison a free man. He was 48 years old. He had spent 19 years, nearly half his life, behind bars. John Artis, his friend and co-defendant, was also released. When Rubin stepped outside, he was greeted by dozens of reporters and hundreds of supporters chanting, "Free the Hurricane." After his release, Rubin decided not to stay in the United States. The country held too many painful memories. He moved to Toronto, Canada, where he was welcomed with open arms. In Canada, Rubin met Lisa Peters, a Canadian activist who had supported him during his fight for freedom. They got married, and Lisa became his rock as he started a new chapter in his life. Rubin dedicated his life to helping others who were wrongfully convicted. He became the director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, a Canadian organization focused on overturning unjust convictions. Over the years, Rubin helped free dozens of people whose cases were similar to his own. He also traveled the world, giving speeches about racial injustice and the need for reform in the justice system. Rubin Carter's story left a lasting mark on culture. In 1999, a movie called The Hurricane was released, starring Denzel Washington as Rubin. The film was critically acclaimed and nominated for an Oscar. Denzel Washington spent months studying Rubin's life, even training with him to capture his fighting style. The movie brought even more attention to the issue of racism in America. Rubin also became the subject of books, documentaries, and songs. His autobiography, The 16th Round, was reprinted several times and continues to inspire people around the world. Rubin showed that even in the darkest circumstances, you can find light and keep fighting for justice. Rubin Carter passed away on April 20, 2014, at the age of 76, after a battle with prostate cancer. His death was a loss to millions, but his legacy lives on. He left behind not just a story of his struggle, but an example of how one person can change the world. Rubin Carter's story is a reminder of how racial injustice can destroy an innocent person's life. 19 years in prison, a lost career, separation from family, all because of a system that saw Rubin not as a man, but as a stereotype. But his story also teaches us that the human spirit is stronger than any chains. Rubin didn't just survive, he triumphed, becoming a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. His life shows that the fight for justice takes incredible resilience. Rubin spent nearly 2 decades in prison, but he never lost faith in the truth. He used his time behind bars to learn, to write, to inspire others. His autobiography, his speeches, his work with the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, all of it became part of his mission to make the world better than the one he grew up in. Sadly, the issues Rubin faced haven't disappeared. Today, in the United States and around the world, racial bias still exists. The Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013, was a response to police brutality and systemic racism. Cases like the killing of George Floyd in 2020 show that Black Americans still face injustice. Rubin's story also highlights problems in the justice system. Wrongful convictions, false testimony, and biased juries continue to ruin lives. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, more than 3,000 people have been exonerated in the U.S. since 1989, many of them Black. These numbers show that the system needs reform. Rubin Carter once said, "Hatred put me in prison, but love set me free." Let's take inspiration from his words and be part of the change. Share this story with your friends. Tell them about Rubin Carter. Support organizations fighting for justice like the Innocence Project or the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. Together, we can make the world a better place. Thank you for watching this video. If it touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep telling the stories that matter. See you in the next video.